All right, welcome everyone to Science and Food 2019. I'm Amy Rowat, a professor of integrative biology and physiology, and it's my pleasure to present to you this evening the future of food in extreme environments. This is a premier event in our 8th, mostly annual public event series. So as many of you know, this event spawned from an undergraduate course that I teach here at UCLA each spring called Science and Food. So the goal with my course and with these annual public events is to take science, something that's not intuitive to many of us, and explain that with something we all understand, food. From the course spawned our nonprofit organization, Science and Food at UCLA. And our mission is to promote knowledge of food through science and science through food. You can learn about these 3 major initiatives of ours on our website and also in the poster in the lobby after the event as well. So before we get started, I need to highlight how all of these initiatives rely on your support and partnership. Your ticket sales and contributions go towards, I'm just gonna have to make a quick note for IT that this is advancing automatically, thank you. Your ticket sales and contributions go towards supporting this very event this evening as well as our outreach initiatives. If you like what we do, why not consider making a tax-deductible donation? You can visit the Support Us page on our website. All right, so with that, I'd also like to acknowledge the following people. And today's event would not have been possible without them. So first of all, Emily Rowland, who's at the back there, for her amazing energy in organizing all aspects of this event this evening. Our Team Core volunteers who prepared those delicious or disgusting taste samples that you enjoyed, thank you. We're indebted to Wendy Slusser of the Semel Healthy Campus Initiative Center and Barney Schlinger and Rochelle Crosby-Watson of my department in Integrative Biology and Physiology here at UCLA for their unwavering support and vision for these events. We're also grateful for our many partners, the LA Times Food Bowl, CNSI, and the INFEWS training grant program, which is supported by the National Science Foundation. So the overarching theme of this year's event is the future of food in extreme environments. And I could tell you how this is a really timely topic given our increasing capabilities to venture into space. I could go on about how critical it is to engage in discussions of alternative ways to grow food in space, given in the face of climate change and the increasing world's population that's expected to reach 8 billion by 2024. But the real reason that we're here tonight to discuss food in space is because of the late Jonathan Gould, foremost food critic and visionary, who we miss dearly. This event was born out of conversations between Jonathan and Chef Carlos Salgado, and was in the works for spring 2018 when we ran into scheduling snafus and had to schedule for this season. So Jonathan has been a constant source of inspiration and support for Science and Food. I first met Jonathan back in 2012 when I was putting together the very first public Science and Food event. That year we had lined up René Redzepi and Lars Williams from NOMA when they wrote to me with an unusual request. They were planning an elaborate series of taste tests and needed, in addition to several other items, hundreds of sand fleas. Of course, René Redzepi, in addition to being one of the world's best chefs, as many of you know, is perhaps the world's leading proponent of foraging. So this was going to be a central demo of his presentation. So flummoxed by the request, I thought about how to find out where to get these sand fleas. So I managed to get in touch with Jonathan, the go-to source in LA to answer food questions ranging from where to source Uzbek spleen sausage to bony Bangladeshi fish. So I managed to write him an email and was delighted that he replied. And while ultimately sourcing the hundreds of sand fleas did not turn out to be a viable solution, Chef Redzepi switched them out for live crickets, which some of you may remember. Jonathan continued to support science and food. He wrote countless pieces about our events and programs, provided critical restaurant recommendations for our visiting chefs, and generously judged several of our scientific bake-offs where students presented their scientific investigations of pies. Well, I'm not sure that Jonathan actually enjoyed eating all of these experimental pies. Chia seeds as a thickener, he described, got stuck in his teeth. Or those modernist deconstructed spherified pies. He wrote in a 2013 piece in the LA Times that messy is best. His presence and articulate voice on science and food truly elevated science and food and maybe also intimidated the students. But just as Jonathan so admirably opened up dialogue among our diverse LA community through food, he brought that same spirit of curiosity about science and food into the public domain. I'm forever grateful. So in that spirit, we are delighted to bring to you tonight this event that Jonathan had envisioned. And a primary driving force behind the theme of food and space is Jonathan's son, Leon, who some of you may see pictured in this judging alongside Jonathan and our scientific bake-off. But he's generously agreed to say some words tonight, so I'm going to invite Leon up to the stage.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan's son and Mark's nephew. So, yeah. So basically, this event is about food and space. Well, future food in extreme environments. And the thing is, food is really hard to get into extreme environments. I mean, because the first problem is because food is very heavy. And the thing is, the scientists basically figured out that there is water in food, and if you can transport water to space, then it's a lot more efficient than leaving the water in the food. So scientists figured out ways to dehydrate food and launch it up to space, where there's already water in the spaceships. So basically, that has led to some okay food, and food in space has had its start. It had its start with John Glenn eating applesauce in the first Gemini flight, and then it turned out, and then when astronauts in the Gemini program had to stay up longer, they had to eat pureed foods in tubes. So in this case, it would be pureed beef and vegetables in a tube. And some astronauts dreaded this so much that the astronaut John Young snuck a corned beef sandwich inside his pocket and take a bite out of it during his flight, but then he put it back in because it was a crumbly sandwich and it could have clogged the air ducts. So, but then people decided to bring up dehydrated food, and the Apollo astronauts had these hot water guns that they shot into their food, and they had some okay meals, actually okay, probably airline food worthy. So scientists on the ISS. Scientists at NASA, as missions got longer and longer and people started to go into the space stations, started trying to improve this food process. So they created a whole system, and that I'm sure they'll tell you a lot about, and to basically make pretty good meals up there. And people like Scott Kelly stayed up for a year and survived pretty well on there, and his morale was intact. So that is a key. A key aspect of food. And Mike Massimino, an astronaut, actually very much praised the lasagna and macaroni in space, saying it was almost like New York. So on the ISS, they've actually done some pretty cool things, like they grew a lettuce plant on the ISS, and they had a salad on the ISS for the first time in history. So they're eating healthy, first of all. And then, but now we are facing the challenges of not 1 year of space, but 3 years on one vessel. So we need to figure out how to get lightweight food that will last for 3 years in space. So how are we doing that? Well, that is up to them. So these people who my uncle will introduce have been researching the problems and aspects of food in space. and they will tell you all about how to get okay food, which boosts the astronauts' morale, into space for the amount of time needed for a Mars mission, which some say 3 years. So,
That's awesome.
all right.
Thank you so much, Leon. So on that note, I'm now going to introduce Leon's uncle, Jonathan's brother, Mark Gold, who will moderate tonight's session. So Dr. Gold is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Environment and Sustainability at UCLA and leader of UCLA's Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. He's a world expert in integrated water management, coastal resource management, and urban sustainability, and serves on Merrick Garcetti's Water Task Force. And we managed him to woo him into moderating this panel with some Tang and tequila because it is slightly out of his expertise, but we so appreciate Mark being here. So thank you, Mark.
Well, thanks, Leon. That's an impossible act to follow. But so my qualifications for being here are basically I'm Jonathan's brother. And so despite spending a lot of time on water, which is extreme environments, I'm not going to be talking about how do they grow all that food in the Imperial Valley in the middle of a desert and why are they using 3.2 million acre feet per year. I'm not going to do that. But people know about Jonathan's love of food, the Dodgers with Vin Scully, the Lakers with Chick, and that darn gas-guzzling Dodge green truck. But however, as his brother, I always admired his unique relationship with his wife and kids. And he was so close with Leon and Isabel and always indulged their intellectual interests. Leon, as you can tell, has always had an obsession with space and physics, and Jonathan thought that really the marriage between his favorite interests, other than thrash metal, LA gangster rap, and Wagnerian opera, and Leon's would be a great topic of discussion at one food bowl or another, and so here we are. And that's why we're all here tonight, and I'm positive Leon would much rather be hearing Andrea Ghez talk about black holes rather than listen to me talking about the joy of Tang, but here we are. So one of the things, just going through each of the, I'll do the introductions first, and I'll start out with something maybe a little bit emotional in the introduction of, in the order that they're going to speak. But Chef Carlos Salgado, obviously is the lead chef of Taco María, and in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, he was named a James Beard Award semifinalist for Best Chef. And my brother Jonathan awarded Carlos the LA Times 2018 Restaurant of the Year, and here's what he wrote. So this was about a year ago. So the Los Angeles area has seen a number of remarkable restaurants open in the last several years, including spaceship fantasies with no recognizable foodstuffs, sushi bars plucked whole from the better precincts of Tokyo, and dining rooms so devoted to local produce that occasionally seems as if they have massive gardens of their own backing up in the kitchen. Yet no restaurant in years may have had quite the impact that Taco María and its chef, Carlos Salgado, have had on the Southern California scene. The restaurant, which serves lasting menus of Salgado's Mexican-influenced cooking, is at the center of a culinary movement that seems to grow in importance each year. By regarding tortillas with a seriousness familiar to any fanatical French baker, by using perfect seasonal produce, and by treating regional Mexican dishes with both imagination and respect, Salgado has propelled California Mexican cooking into the jet stream of abstracted modernist cuisine. And that he has done all this in an almost anti-luxurious dining room in a Costa Mesa hipster mall, an hour's drive from many of his fans and colleagues, is almost a miracle. Taco María has given not only Los Angeles, but his native Orange County a sense of place. A place where roasted guinea hens with mole, tortillas stuffed with sturgeon and asparagus velouté with spring garlic, stand beside crocks of mushroom chorizo and marinated Baja blood clams. Should we be thankful that we can also sometimes get tacos, at least in the afternoon? Indeed. Taco María is Restaurant of the Year. So that's Carlos.
Okay, now I'm hungry.
The second speaker will be Dr. Michele Perchonok. She recently retired after working for 17 years at the NASA Johnson Space Center as manager of the NASA Human Research Program. As program science manager, prior to holding that position, Michele was the Human Research Program Advanced Food Technologist and the Shuttle Food Systems Manager with numerous duties, including space food product development and the integration of NASA food science research for space exploration missions. And she has a background with a BS in chemistry from Brown and a MS and PhD in food science from Cornell. And third, last but not least, is Dr. Heather Hava, space gardener. She's the one where you read the bio and you sort of think, is that the character in The Martian, Mark Watney, you know, greatest botanist on the planet? I'm guessing she's probably heard that a few times at the University of Colorado. She's an inventor as well. She's committed to creating game-changing innovations and technologies with the power to maximize health and well-being of humans on Earth and in space. And her very long research background in effects of food systems and human-plant interactions on astronauts' well-being, as well as work on space habitat design. She's also an entrepreneur, is the founder CEO of Stellar Synergetics and co-founder CEO of Autoponics. She's pursuing a PhD in the Aerospace Engineering Sciences program with an emphasis in bioastronautics. We don't have that major here, just to let you know, in UCLA. At the University of Colorado Boulder, and holds an MS from this program as well, and a bachelor's from Oregon Institute of Technology. So with that, let's get going on the individual talks.
And one more small note that I forgot to add is that there are cue cards for you to write questions on, and volunteers will be coming around, disseminating them, picking them up. And so if you have a question, we'll be collecting them and handing them over to Mark.
Yeah, and so the way this has worked, the format will be each of the speakers, starting with Carlos, will give us 5 to 7 minutes. And then after the 3 of them, then we'll start doing a little Q&A, and then you guys will jump in. Thanks.
How's everyone? I would be here then, right? My slides? Yep. Great. So welcome. Thank you for having me. I feel a little bit out of place at a university surrounded by PhDs as a guy who just barely made it through culinary school. But I have a lifelong interest in this particular topic. In our family, you're born a cook, so I've always been a cook, and very early on, I wanted to be, at various times, aeronautics engineer, astronaut, physicist, chemist. These days, after about 20 years cooking, and about 5 years after my restaurant, I've decided that instead I just want to be a gardener and a woodworker and a backyard astronomer. So I say this because, that's me, because, Taco María is not a restaurant. And I'm not really a cook. I'm not really a chef. My interests are in cultivating and engendering circumstances where food can give form to the cultural excellence that happens between people who care about each other. I see Taco María as a place for my community, which increasingly includes visitors from LA, which is tremendous. It's a small restaurant where I can hopefully get to know everyone who comes visits us, and I can use my interests in science to perform my responsibilities as a chef better. One of those responsibilities is to, of course, care for traditions, care for the history of my culture and of other cultures as well, care for the health of my community, care for the health and well-being of my employees. And so, Taco María, as I see it, is a synthesis of these things. It just so happens that we serve food and regrettably have to charge for it. But again, that's the reason for the existence of the restaurant. Now, a lot of people in my space, which is to say the restaurant industry, a lot of people in my space might think of science and food as something like El Bulli, if anyone is familiar with the restaurant, Chef Ferran and his brother Albert Adria from Spain, who sort of created this, let's say, a sort of phase in our industry of extremely abstract food informed by scientific technique, or rather, I should say, informed by industrial technique from the food manufacturing industry. So I lived through the sort of tail end of molecular gastronomy at a few restaurants that I worked at in San Francisco. And I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of that food yielded things that, well, there's a reason that they don't exist anymore. And it's because they didn't necessarily reflect any individual culture, or I should say any real human culture. They were abstractions and in the minds of, generally speaking, young men, playing with toys of with very simplistic sort of scientific approaches and tools and techniques. Instead, you see science in general, scientific study, space exploration, really should serve the humanities, and that is the preservation of life, the preservation of our planet, our ecosystem, and as well, but most importantly, the preservation of our culture. So if we aspire to get ourselves off this rock and go to Mars and sustain human life on a second planetary body, then there's the question of who's going, what do they take with them? Because wherever you put two or more people together, a culture will naturally emerge. A community and practices will emerge. And so whether we take wheat has a history and a story and a cultural identity attached to it. Corn has a different one. This is the corn that we use at Taco María to make our tortillas, and it's a beautiful storied corn that's been cared for by a multi-generational farming family in a small village in Mexico, and it comes to us direct from them, and we're very proud to be able to create a larger market. Indeed, they're planting hundreds of times more than they ever have in their family's history, and even spreading it to other farmers in the community in order to be able to supply more and more Mexican-American restaurants that have an interest in preserving these seeds. We do serve tacos from time to time. And this is one that we produce from that corn. And we produce it by using, if my food is good in any way, and sometimes people say that it is, then I believe it's because of my background in science and engineering and art, and using those things in order to, again, execute the mechanics of cooking produces a pretty good result. Now, so my interest in food in extreme environments, especially in space, is how does the process of manipulating food in order to make it more efficient or more effective to travel or to grow in unusual environments. How does that affect the cultural significance of the food items that we take? So again, if we take corn to Mars, we're taking one particular culture and one story. If we take rice or wheat, do we take peppers? Do we take chilies? What role does sugar play in space, and sweets? I'm actually a pastry chef. I'm just faking the savory Mexican food thing. So all of these questions are very important, and it's important that in the process of manipulating food for these environments, that we not lose the cultural importance of it. There you are.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know which way to go. So thank you for inviting me also. I appreciate, this is my favorite topic to talk about this. I am retired, but I'm also, people say I'm not really retired because I'm president of the Institute of Food Technologists, which is my professional society. And so I get to go talking to our regional sections about this topic. So I'm going to give you, my goal this evening is to start out and just sort of set the stage for you, to have you understand what we've done. And Luke, you did a great job of sort of starting that process, so I appreciate it. So currently, and this is, about a year or so ago, it was announced NASA's going back to the moon. We keep going back and forth, or I keep saying we, it's they now, so, but keep going back and forth, go to an asteroid, go to the moon, whatever. But now NASA's planning to go to the moon. Right now, as Luke said, on International Space Station, the most people have been on is about 11 months. Scott Kelly says it's a one-year mission. It was closer to 11 months. There will be 5 more one-year missions so that NASA can understand what happens to that human body as they're in microgravity or zero gravity, we call it microgravity, for that long. Moon is 1/6 gravity, and the good news is now we can test some of the, they can test some of the technologies that you're going to need from a Mars extended mission closer to home, because the moon is only maybe, depending on how they do the orbits, a few days to a week away. Mars is actually going to be probably they keep upping the number, but right now it's about 32 to 34 month mission. Because they're going to take 6 to 8 months to get there, again in microgravity. The planets have a very strange alignment orbit, and they'll stay there for 18 months and then come home for 6 to 8 months. And so, but when you start thinking about the food, that food is going to have closer to a 5 to 7 year shelf life. Now, a couple reasons why. One, for International Space Station missions, every 6 weeks to 3 months, they get a resupply mission. If you might have heard, Blue Origin just launched and brought up some supplies in the last few days to International Space Station. In addition, to make all the food or pack all the food, and we'll talk a little bit more about packaged versus fresh food, it's going to take a while for everyone to make that. So just to get the logistics, it's going to take a while. And finally, NASA's talking about positioning the food in advance to the mission, whether it's in orbit to Mars or on the surface of Mars before the astronauts get there. So 5 to 7 year shelf life. Very few foods have that on Earth, except for the military. And we can talk about that, but anyway. There's several components to the food system, and this really works for here on Earth as well as on a NASA mission, but you have to think about it a little bit more, how important the resource part of it is. But we all want safe, acceptable, and nutritious food. If it's not acceptable, you're not going to eat it. Even if you're starving, you probably won't eat enough nutrition to keep you healthy and able to think clearly. But the difference is now there are vehicle resources. And those resources, and I think Luke mentioned, food is heavy. Well, yes, it's something on the order of 12,000 kilograms, which is 24,000 pounds of food plus packaging, if all you did was bring a packaged food system for a crew of 6 for a Mars mission. That's a lot of food. So, and crew time, clearly. And sometimes this balancing act doesn't work right, because you may be saying, I want a long shelf life. Well, I'll do that with a refrigerator, but a refrigerator takes power, takes a lot of volume, takes a lot of mass. And of course, we know that there's a psychology to food also. We want to make sure that has the variety and the acceptability. And people say, well, a pill. That'll get their nutrition, but we want it to be familiar because they are far away from home, and you want to make sure that this is an enjoyable time. Variety. How do you make the food? You're not going to be able to go to your favorite restaurant because you don't feel like what's in the pantry that day. So you have to make sure there's enough variety and socialization. So the picture on the left is actually one of their Thanksgiving dinners on International Space Station. There are Super Bowl dinners, and of course it's an international cruise, so sometimes they have other events with the Europeans, the Japanese. When the shuttle went up there, they would also host the International Space Station crew with a special meal. So there is the top right picture is the current food system packaged, and yes, it has the dehydrated. You can see mac and cheese there. It's got beverages that are dried, similar to Tang. There are the pouch products that look like the meals ready to eat from the military, but are NASA's own formulations or recipes, if you want to call it that are much more suited for space travel and not 20-something-year-old soldiers that are walking 10 miles in the desert. And I'm guessing that on a Mars mission, it's not my decision, and it's certainly none of the food scientists' decision, but the managers, is that it's going to be a combination of the packaged food and grown food. And so the items on the left, the plant chamber crops, are the ones that I think are still official crops that we are working towards, or they're working towards. And then my guess is that at least in the beginning, we will bring up the bulk ingredients in the hulls to keep the shelf life a little bit longer, with the rice, the dried beans, the peanuts, the wheat, and the soybeans. And hopefully you can have the soybeans that are higher in protein for the tofu and higher in oil for the oil, and you don't have to worry about crops not working that you can't harvest. And then, of course, preparation gets more complicated. So now on International Space Station, they basically heat, hydrate, and eat. They can pull the food out of the pantry and open it, prepare it, whether it's heating it, hydrating it, eat it, and clean up in less than an hour. We did a study at NASA several years ago and said if the whole meal was not packaged and we had to prepare the food, meaning that you would grate the carrots and you would mill the wheat, and et cetera, it would take one person 8 hours a day to feed a crew of 6. I don't know about you, but if I were to go to Mars, I'm not sure how much I would want to spend in the galley or the kitchen. But again, there is the variety. So maybe one day you have your pasta with a red sauce, and the next day it's just a vegetables, or maybe you add a little bit of packaged chicken to it. So, but the galley becomes pretty complicated with some pretty high-end, I'll call them appliances to help things along. And hopefully with the Mars gravity of 3/8 gravity, the food will stay on the pan. And I am done. How's that?
Okay. Just want to check, make sure this is working. Okay, very good. So that was a great introduction that I got. I always love hearing everybody else's introduction because I think we all sound more impressive than any of us really are when other people read it. But often people ask me, how did I end up in this field? And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste, pun intended, of how I ended up being a space gardener. So first of all, I am not an engineer. I'm an artist trapped in an engineer's body, and therefore I believe in creating beautiful machines and using both sides of my brain to create these systems. And I'm going to go really fast tonight so we can cover lots of ground. But basically, one of the most formidable experiences when I was in undergrad was I spent a 2-week mission at the Mars Desert Research Station, which is a Mars analog in Utah, and I was the health and safety officer, which I was like, what do they do? And the truth was, like, if anybody gets sick or needs a Band-Aid, you give them that. And I was like, okay, so I need something else to do for the mission. So I volunteered to be the crew chef. Little did I know that the handoff list I was going to get said to buy macaroni and cheese and ramen because it was another college student crew right before us. And I was like, oh, I don't think so. So I asked the crew of 6 if I could volunteer to be the crew chef, and they were all good with that. And I will attest to what Michele said is correct, because I spent pretty much all my day cooking. Little did I know that would be the case. But I ended up having to ration food when I got into the 2nd week because I was literally counting slices of bread to make sure that there was going to be enough sandwiches. And I was like, nobody gets toast for breakfast or we're not having lunch. So that was a hard place to be, but it taught me something very important. And that's when I got excited about food and habitats and how to integrate them. Okay, so sustainability. If we're going to leave Earth, how do we go there and how do we stay sustainable? Or stay there sustainably. You can see this is a picture from Voyager, and that little blue dot is us when Voyager looked back as it was leaving the solar system. So that's all of us right there on that tiny little pixel. But that means that we need to take something like Earth with us if we're going to go and stay there for 3 years. So the question is, explorers throughout history have had to make the same decision. Do we bring it or do we grow it? And the truth is, if you're only staying for a short period of time, you're going to bring it. But if you're going to become a homesteader, or like what I like to say, a domesteader on Mars, then you need to grow some of that food. And you can see here that this is the International Space Station with veggie outrageous lettuce that they're growing. Also, the Polynesians brought their canoe plants to Hawaii, and these are special plants. So this is our first canoe plant of space. Okay, you heard a little bit of a history about food. I'm going to go through this really quick, but I just want to make the point. Do you want a strawberry cube or rehydrated strawberries, or do you want to eat fresh strawberries? And even in all of our science fiction, especially more currently The Martian, but we dreamed about strawberries in space. But in order to do this, you need to use biological systems. And if we're going to use biological systems for food, what else can we get from these systems? Of course, we're going to get atmosphere revitalization, so CO2, O2, water reclamation, food production, and waste processing. But that's all basic life support functions. And my research is more about how can we use nature for the other benefits. So if you like to go outdoors and you know how it de-stresses you, maybe you go out and run, I want to use that to help astronauts stay healthy as well. Of course, we can also give them other things like sensory stimulation, improved nutrition, variety, and of course, reduced resupply and more self-sufficiency. So the design philosophy here is how can we use bliss, and I say nature is bliss with the I in it, because that is life support plus access to nature. How can we use that to improve the crew's well-being beyond their nutritional needs? And you can see these are zinnias that were grown on space station and what that invokes in you. If you were that far from home, wouldn't you love to have some pretty flowers? So we just came back from Langley Research Center last week for a competition to design a Mars habitat, or I'm sorry, a Mars greenhouse, and this is Sirona. Sirona is our vision of what a Mars greenhouse would look like. However, you can see that this isn't just a greenhouse, it can also function as a secondary emergency habitat. It has a kitchen and a bathroom, which are important features. We also have deployable sleep structure that can be up in the lounge area if you see on the right side. But this is a very special greenhouse. So I will talk more, actually, let me just back up really quick, because let me just say something about Sirona. I'm not going to be able to get into details in this little quick introduction. If you want to know more about the technology, I'm happy to talk about it or afterwards. But we're looking at using permaculture principles such as a food forest, so growing fruit trees, dwarf fruit trees, and also aquaponics or integrated multi-trophic aquaponics, meaning we have fish and mussels and shellfish that can use more of the leftover fish pellets and inedible biomass to increase the output of the greenhouse. Okay, so which do you want to live in? Do you want to live in space station and then have a separate growth chamber that's meant to exclude you and only to go and pick your stuff, or do you want to be in Sirona where you can enjoy cooking your meals and eating them in an outdoor garden park area? Okay, but they're not there to be they're there to be astronauts, not necessarily farmers, right? Or which is it? Or is it astronaut farmer? Or is it robot farmer? Or do we need a combination of the two? So some more of my research is how do we optimize between what the crew does and what the robots do. And we've developed, worked on several different automation systems, but one of them is called Roger, Remotely Operated Gardening Rover. And Roger can do tasks like transplanting, pollination, and germination of seeds. What we want to do is have Roger do the tasks that humans don't like to do. If you ever garden, you know weeding is not fun. We won't have weeds, but there's other things that won't be fun or take lots of time, and we want the crew to do things like harvesting and actually literally getting the fruits of their labor. With something like Roger, the crew will spend maybe 20 minutes a day each taking care of the greenhouse, and Roger will save them about 180 minutes. So you need a lot of decision support if you're going to have them do farming. They're not there to be farmers, as I mentioned. So you need something like AgQ in the brain that can tell the crew when to do tasks and when to tell Roger when to do tasks. One of the things we want to do is have the astronauts get to use horticulture therapy and have those tasks be done when maybe they're stressed out writing a report they don't want to write anymore, and stop and take a break and go and tend to the plants. So just to back it up and bring it back to where we started, which is why do we even care about this? Well, you are what you eat, and variety is the spice of life. And so I just wanted to point out that with having a greenhouse like this, you can have improved palatability, improved food intake, performance, and improved mood. And once you get past having enough food and reliable food, then we care about things about good tasting and novel foods and food as medicine. Okay, so really quick, I'm about done. I just want to bring a little tiny history lesson, one more to end with, is that how did we end up being astronauts in the first place? So somewhere along the line, we started out as a primate of some sort, and we ended up as astronauts. And along the way, there was actually a chimp astronaut as well. And part of what happened was animals essentially learned how to cook. We ended up eating cooked food from forest fires, and that allowed our brain to get bigger. Probably Amy can tell you better, and our intestinal tract to improve in terms of efficiency, and therefore, eventually we ended up being able to go into space. And just to kind of round this out, I can't get into the details, but we are planning on 32 different crops, 4 aquatic crops, and 6 different seafoods in Sirona. And I'm going to quickly just show you a very short fly-through of Sirona, and this is what it would be like to be inside Sirona and cooking your food and enjoying your meals with your crew near your waterfall and mussel tank, and then having a lovely seating area for your freshly squeezed kumquat juice in the morning. And that is, now you can just see it from above, so thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
That was great. Thank you guys for your presentations. Carlos, just to sort of start us off, I couldn't help notice you're rocking your NASA kicks. Can you give us?
Thank you. Thank you for noticing.
How'd you get so into space? Like, what's the background?
That's a good question. Like, how did I get into eating? So it's just
That was a necessity.
somehow. Well, turns out to be a necessity. Space travel turns out to be a necessity as well, doesn't it? No, I always had a scientific curiosity, and as I said, I sort of thought that was my path. Interesting. I was speaking with someone the other day on the subject of, like, well, representation matters, right? So when I was a kid, I never thought that I could attend college because I grew up poor, and I never thought that I would certainly not make it into graduate school, and then certainly not be able to move on to NASA. So I always was at the sidelines. That said, I've been self-educating for my entire life, of course, and after spending many years in technology, in the computer industry, rather than back then we called it the early web industry, I sort of realized that my scientific interests and my intelligence, my math ability, my understanding of physics and chemistry and engineering could allow me to sort of practice the family craft, and then from there, that gave me the opportunity to take up astronomy, and that's where I am now.
Right. Questions for Michele and Heather. You talked a little bit about the extreme environmental challenges that food production face in space. The average surface temperature of Mars is -80 degrees Fahrenheit, so obviously a little bit different than here. and life on Earth's adapted to a much warmer range of temperatures. What are the technical challenges of growing food in space, and how do you overcome them? Who wants to? Either one of you.
Well,
can take it on.
I'll just start, because one of the comments that people, or one of the questions I typically get is, well, you can store food on Mars because it's really cold there, and actually it's too cold. So the cell structure, the packaging breaks down, the cell structure breaks down, and I'm sure Heather can talk more, but it will be in plant chambers with controlled environment, both lighting and water and nutrients and humidity and such.
So it's not like the Midwest where you put your pack of beer outside in the snow?
No. Well, and I've actually, when I was at NASA, challenged the engineers, the vehicle engineers, and said, all I need is a little bit of cold air from space. Can you give me that? And the problem is you put any hole in a habitat, and that's just asking for trouble unless you can really seal it well. And so their preference is not to do that. Now, it is not clear that the packaged food system will ever have a 5 to 7 year shelf life for nutrition purposes. And so the question becomes, all right, if that's the case, do you go and try to be more creative and find that way to be able to get that cold into the habitat?
I just like to add on to that, and I'm not sure why they didn't do this, and I'm not a refrigeration expert, just to be clear, but I don't know why they wouldn't just use radiators. I mean,
Too much.
really,
It's
yeah.
too much insulation, too much weight. That the group at Johnson Space Center years and years ago, in 2000, were developing refrigerators, and it just didn't make sense. It may have to happen, but.
And I just want to follow on to the other, specifically for growing food. So she mentioned a lot of the technical things, which I didn't really get into with Sirona, but the idea is that you would be pulling in all this data and trying to highly control this environment to give the plants the best environment, to optimize for their growth. Of course, that is not an easy thing to do, and that is one reason that the current architecture that you saw is they want to keep the humans out and the plants at their ideal conditions, because, say, humans like maybe 50% humidity and plants really like to be at 80% humidity, and same with temperature ranges. They're not necessarily fully compatible. But if your goal is not just optimizing biomass and number of calories, and your goal is some of the things I spoke of, then you are willing to compromise the optimal plant conditions to make it a comfortable space for the humans to spend time in as well. And I think that if your goal is to improve well-being overall, then that is the right solution. And so even with that said, you can then use LEDs to get controlled light, and then use fiber optics to bring in solar light to optimize between power and mass. So that's what this system used. And so the solar lighting system, for instance, just needs very minor power to track the sun and pipe it in through fiber optics, whereas the LEDs take a lot of power, but you get really good control over the spectrum to make the plants do what you want when you want them, like flower and fruit at specific times. So the combination of the two lets you reduce power and mass and have controllability.
And I will add one quick thing, is that in all of, and this is getting on one of my soapboxes when I was at Johnson Space Center, is don't develop all of the conditions so that the plant just is really productive. Make sure that edible piece is edible and acceptable. Because I have had many years ago, and I hope they have improved them, some really bad cherry tomatoes. And it's like, I wouldn't even want to eat them. So anyway.
That sounds like most strawberries bought in the store nowadays.
Yeah. So, but optimizing not only for the production, but also for flavor and nutrition.
So that being said, what is there about the system that really has that impact on taste? Has that been optimized over time, and what are the factors that make that happen?
So a lot of that has to do with cultivar selection, and I think Carlos talked about, like, for instance, what type of corn or what type of crop that you're growing, and you could maybe speak some more to that. But it does have a lot to do with the environmental factors. So one thing about the tomatoes, that has to do partially with the cultivar, but if you've ever eaten hydroponically grown tomatoes, a lot of people say, oh, they're just basically big red balls of water, there's no flavor. But if you actually stress a plant a little bit, it produces a lot of these phytonutrients that give it flavor and nutrients. So one thing you can do is trick plants into producing these chemicals that you want. So like zeaxanthin protects your eyes from radiation, which is important for astronauts. And by using the different lighting regime or temperature or other things like inducing salt stress, you can get these plants to produce those chemicals that make them taste good and extra nutritious.
Is there just the nature of the systems, it just ends up that you end up having food with less taste? Is that a typical thing that applies across all sorts of food, or is it just, or is there just, so there's no set impacts from growing food in space that are consistent? Like studies haven't demonstrated anything in particular there?
No, but we do have anecdotal reports that in microgravity, food doesn't taste the same. Mm-hmm. And there are probably several factors. One is in microgravity, hot air doesn't rise, and the aromas are hot air, and so they could be at your feet. And again, because of resources, they don't heat the food up as hot, so there may not be as much aroma. And they're eating out of small slits of the package. We don't know on Mars. 3/8 gravity, is that enough to get the aromas to your nose? And 85 to 90% of what you taste is really what you smell. The only thing you're tasting is the sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. And so we don't know on Mars what that will be.
So you have to cook all your sauces with alcohol then on Mars.
Well, on ISS, they bring up a lot of hot sauce.
Yeah.
They really, and they just want the flavor.
Yeah, well, but what kind? That's very important.
I don't think they get the good kind, but one thing I wanted to add to that, the other thing that's challenging about microgravity from a physiological perspective is, here we have gravity that pushes the fluids to our feet, but when you're in zero gravity, that water column actually equalizes, and so if you've ever had a head cold or have allergies, you get stuffed up and now all of a sudden nothing tastes, you can't taste, that's essentially what they're experiencing the entire time they're in space, because they're stuffy for that whole time. And that, again, contributes to that lack of being able to smell their food, so there's a multifactorial impact, but at least on Mars, you would get some of that.
Yeah, if you look at people in space, we call them Charlie Brown faces, because their faces have gotten really round because of all that fluid in them.
When I visited NASA to see the food programs that they had there when I was in Florida a couple years ago, there was a lot of discussion of the artificial regolith, the growing medium, soil replacements. There's one discussion about 3D printing, like plastic soil alternatives, and so any farmer, any gardener, any chef will tell you that dirt and plant and animal waste is incredibly important to the pleasure that is derived from eating a particular food. The soil that your tomato grows in California, we all have the privilege of knowing this, that the specific farm, the specific place, the time of year, the soil, the proximity to the ocean, the proximity to other types of plants or to the peach orchard or what have you. And that's not just like flowery description, idyllic description of food farming. It's true that it influences the flavor of food tremendously. So for my part, I would like to see over time in our discussions of growing food and eating in space, the perspectives of people who live close to the earth and very close to some of the fine agricultural products that we have all over the world, in order to make sure that the systems that we describe to achieve this goal of populating another planet, let's say, or even living in space for long periods for research purposes. That it preserves that important aspect of eating, because, I mean, what else does it mean to be human if not to, eat and enjoy, growing and sharing time with people and reproducing and all else.
Yeah, just to add on to that. So in Sirona, some of the things he mentioned are super important. We are looking at using a biowick. If you saw where the little fruit trees were in there. And that biowick passively uses human waste, so human manure, to grow fruit trees. And one thing that I'd like to mention about that is people go, ugh, but it's done here. The biowick is actually technology that's being used on Earth, and I'm proposing to adapt it to use in space. And the truth is that if you do want to grow plants in space, you need to recycle those inputs and outputs. You're not going to take all that with you and then just have all that inedible biomass, the part you don't eat, and all of the. And so I say waste is actually a dirty word. It's sort of it's not an F-friendly word. It's not like food. And so if it comes out of the system somewhere, it needs to go back into the system and be an input and be used. And so I think that some of that can come. Of course, we need to prove the safety of it for astronaut health, but and that system uses a recycled foam glass growth media. And so eventually we could transition to using Mars regolith and create soil by taking that inedible biomass and the fish manure and the human manure and mixed with that growth media and create a Martian soil.
All right, let's move to the food culture questions. And Carlos, I was just wondering if you could, you get to go to the to be a Mars astronaut. What three foods would you type of foods would you take culturally that are
That's
so
an impossible
important
question, of course. Impossible question. I would take absolutely Valentina hot sauce. That's very important. Nothing else would do.
It's not a renewable resource.
Dairy, ice cream,
Space goats?
space goats, goat milk, lovely, wonderful goat yogurt, cheese, absolutely. I'm just going to keep talking about dairy.
So we won't talk about environmental impacts of dairy.
And I'm my parents' son, so I couldn't live without beans. Proud beaner.
And how about you guys? What would you choose?
I can't do without chocolate, so I'm sorry.
We can grow this in the biowick.
So, and probably some sort of tomato or lettuce. I love salad, so, and cheese.
But what kind?
I'll take any
Gouda, of
cheese.
course.
I really will take any cheese.
I don't know if you noticed, but I'm a real fan of strawberries. I think the fruiting plants are super important, not only because who doesn't love fruit, but in the process before we get the fruit is we have beautiful flowers. And so again, looking at that multifunctionality of access to nature prior to getting to enjoy the fruits. So while lettuce, you can get the outrageous lettuce that's red and green, I don't think it still has the same beauty as a blossoming, fruit tree. And from California, you guys see these, or like, Washington, D.C. with the cherry trees. So yeah, I think the edible landscaping foods would be my high priority. And definitely, I think some of the fish, barramundi. Oh, I love barramundi, which is in Sirona, by the way.
A very, very quick question. Maybe one of you can tell the story better than I could. Remember the story of the lima bean sprout on ISS and how the crew, when asked to essentially destroy it because the experiment was over, that they hid it in a corner of the station outside of view of the cameras because it had become an organism that they developed a relationship with.
Right. And that is a problem that I've talked about in my research a lot, is that if these plants become your pets, and actually that's one thing we want to encourage, plant as pet, does that make it hard for you to harvest and eat that pet? So, or the other thing is, if you're depending on it for life support and for your nutrition, and you start to see that plant die, is that going to stress you out instead of giving you reduced stress? So I think, like Michele mentioned, if you know that you have enough calories, at least you have some mental relief that that's not the case. But I do know that there's been multiple times the astronauts have grown, an onion sprouted that they didn't eat before they got to it, and they kept it wrapped in paper towel, wet paper towels, to try to keep it alive. And on Mir, that there was an astronaut that apparently, according to hearsay, turned all of Mir into like a veritable jungle. So we desperately, it's called biophilia, need that connection with nature, and we subconsciously seek it. And therefore, I think that it will be more of a problem psychologically if we don't provide access to nature for 3 years.
All right. Let's get to some of these questions and mix them in as well. How much work's being done with genetics to make food easier, better to grow in space? Is that something that people are looking into?
I think so. So 15 years ago, if you talked about genetically engineering a plant, they would say, "Oh, don't say that." You know, the managers of NASA were saying that could bring up a lot of concern. But really, it makes
there's a lot of places where that still would
yes,
bring up a concern.
yes, and I recommend anyone to stream the movie Food Evolution if you want to get some really good science on GMOs and the pros and cons. But it makes sense. You're going to want to make sure that you can genetically modify the seed so that it creates a very acceptable, high-producing, probably dwarf size so that you're not bringing in a lot and maybe not as much unusable biomass. So yes, I don't know if they're doing any work in that, but I know there's been a lot of talk about doing it.
Yeah, I mean, and like specifically, for instance, you had the dwarf plum up there, and that's in Sirona. The USDA has a specific breed of plum that goes from seed to fruit in 1 year and doesn't require dormancy, meaning it doesn't have to go through a winter cycle in order to fruit. And I mean, it's like this big, it's like a shrub. And they developed it for studying some diseases in plum that they were trying to research. But it turns out that if you can knock out genes like not needing a dormancy period, not having to go through that winter cycle in a greenhouse, now all the temperate climate crops become an option potentially. Whereas, I typically point towards like things like banana or subtropic, tropic things because they don't require dormancy. But I do think that there's an advantage if you want to consider those kinds of foods, then you need to go that route. Or, for instance, reducing inedible biomass, that kind of stuff. But they are looking at, in a lot of other plant areas, how do we breed back in wild genes into these, different foods that now have no taste? They'll last on the shelf forever, but again, they have no flavor. And so I think that there will be a combination of, looking at those factors, or, creating something that's really easy to harvest for the robot. Like, there's a big consideration, right? Like, we can manipulate our fingers very easily, but robots, there's only certain tasks right now they're very good at. So you could potentially get the plants to help you out with some of those automation tasks by encouraging them to grow certain ways.
If I may.
Another question. Bioregenerative food production in space holds tremendous promise for applications here on Earth, and there's a couple questions sort of related to this, particularly in shifting us to a more sustainable food system. What are some technologies, both close to commercialization and maybe many years off, in the future that you're most excited about?
I know Carlos wanted to say something just on that other thought before.
And it relates to commercialization of these technologies as well. I sort of think of this. I think of this larger question sort of backwards. One of our primary concerns, obviously, is survival of the species in the long term. That's really why we look up and why we look out and why we want to travel there, because of the necessity of becoming an interplanetary science or interplanetary species. Now, it's necessary at the moment for the work that we do to be extremely precise, mediated, controlled, because of the resource issues inherent in this great effort. But again, working backwards, the goal should ultimately be to live as humans live, surrounded by other organisms, plants and animals, to live the way that we have always lived, and not strip all the culture out of living. So at the moment, the way, if you read a lot and you listen to scientists in the space program talk about the human element and the cultural element, a lot of funny words sort of come up into the language, don't they? Now, so when we discuss GMOs, for example, you just mentioned engineering wild characteristics back into plants that are maybe flavorless because they've been mechanically altered, structurally altered for a particular aim. One of the dangers of, I think, the way in which increasingly this research technology and food industry technology begin to sort of merge is that if by the time we take our food production, our foodways, to another far-off place, have we eliminated what it is that's most important and the reason that we love food to begin with? The Alberta peach. You won't engineer one. Human society has to create that lore and that culture. The French prune plum, the conico azul maíz, the corn that we use for our tortillas. These foods that we enjoy so much we enjoy because they come from a place and we connect with that distant time and those people as well. So
I just want to play devil's advocate for 1 second.
I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, as an agrarian society, or when we transitioned from hunter-gatherer into being agrarian, we started manipulating plants from the very get-go. We figured out which plants in wild grew the best, and then we started saving those seeds, and then we propagated them, and those seeds became climatized to those local areas. And if I took those seeds from one region and I brought them somewhere else and planted them several generations, then they became climatized to that. So we've been modifying plants' genes intentionally, which is what cultivar actually means. A cultivar is something that a human has created, and so I think that the question, and this is a totally different topic, is whether or not the way in which that happens. So is it something you could reproduce naturally, like what I just spoke of, through breeding and selection, or is it something strange that could never happen in nature, like salmon genes and strawberries? Not going to happen naturally. So I think that's a different discussion, but I just wanted to say that we have done that from the very beginning of becoming agrarian.
Forgive me, I wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't a
No,
GMO pro or con.
right.
pro or
No,
con.
I just wanted to branch that out, and I think that eventually that's true for Mars. Those seeds will become climatized to Mars in that low gravity over many generations. They will be a unique cultivar to Mars and no longer unique to Earth anymore.
So there's no question in my mind that if Carlos was in charge of this Mars mission, that culture would be adequately taken into consideration. That being said, what is NASA doing to really take that into consideration, and what does that even mean to NASA, since that's not the norm in really how the agency thinks?
They do think about that.
Yeah,
You can talk more
so,
about that.
I think 20 years ago, NASA was not thinking about that, and the food team had a really hard time convincing the managers that we had to consider the acceptability and the cultural part of the food and the socialization of the food as much as producing it and what the nutrition was, acceptability.
So how does that manifest itself in a mission?
So now what it does is we'll see what the managers ultimately decide, but there's a true understanding that this is very important. And in the human research program that I spent my last part of my career with, they have a whole what we call element or project that's on human behavior. And how do you understand what it means to be far away from home, and how do you team build, and what about things like long-term acceptability of food? You get tired of the food. How much variety do you need? And so there is, they are collecting data. They are trying to understand that. Now, I won't venture even to guess if it's a decision on massive food and how much it's going to cost to launch it and the acceptability, which one will win out. I hope they will compromise. But we'll have to wait and see. But at least they are very aware now that this is an important piece. And everything from the Apollo astronauts, when I had to fight to keep hot water when we were first going back to the moon in the like 2005, they didn't want to have hot water in the vehicle because it took up too much power. And I had Apollo astronauts, we went through a whole workshop, and they said, do not take away my hot coffee. No way. They listened to the astronauts. But that's a lot less than plants and acceptability. But I think if we get the input from the astronauts, and we get and they do debriefs for every International Space Station astronaut, previously from shuttle, we'll start hearing that information of how important it is to have my own choice of what I'm eating today. That's even important to them.
And I just wanted to add on to that. I mean, right now, they do ship, seasonal foods, holiday foods, and they know that's important. They do ship, some of their favorite snacks, and their family gets involved in some of that. So they are starting to implement some of those things. But I think the other piece of it is, from a growing perspective, is we are talking about choice of what you get to eat, but also to some extent what you get to grow. So even though I wish I could click through my slides here, the backups, but my long list of 32 crops, it's just notional, because really that crew, I mean, if you really don't like bok choy or kale, even though it might be really healthy for you, you're not going to eat it. What's the point? So
What kind of barbarian doesn't like kale?
We got some military astronauts that probably don't.
Yeah, and then I've talked to other astronauts that have said, like they're fine with eating the same thing for months on end, and they don't really care, and it's usually the military people who are more inclined to be able to tolerate that. But people have different thresholds, so I think it's going to be really dependent on the crew. And the last thing I want to add to that is, talking about seasons. So one thing is, in a space habitat, you don't have that connection to change of seasons. So if you can grow strawberries that fruit around 4th of July for strawberry shortcake, and some sort of squash or pumpkin that you can make fresh pie, pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, we actually as a culture mark time by the foods we eat, or at least we used to before everything was in the grocery store any time of the year. And some people are trying to go back to seasonally eating, and I think that is another way that they can include some of that importance in their diet.
What are the limits in on something like the Mars mission and how you can prepare the food? I mean, you were saying, culturally appropriate, and I'm going like, can you make a latke in space? I'm just not sure. So like,
I'll find a way. I'll do it for you.
We don't know. That's the simple answer. So 3/8 gravity. All of the physicists will tell us that it seems to act closer to 1G, where we are here on Earth, than microgravity. But we don't know. We're assuming that there can be a galley with an oven or a stove, and that you can saute or cook. But then there's one other piece that you have to think about is, if you're going to have a high oil food like a latke, I don't know about you, but every time a friend of mine makes latkes, which are potato pancakes, fried potato pancakes, it smells up the neighborhood.
You're in Los Angeles. Everyone knows what
Okay,
a latke is.
okay, good. I'm not sure.
But she lived in Houston.
Yeah,
so
Houston, they didn't know it. But,
for a long, and I lived in Houston too for 3 years working on Orion, and I totally understand like why you would say
yes,
that.
but you're in an enclosed environment. You can't open the window to get the smells out. And so, and it costs resources to run the fans longer or the filters. So there's going to have to be some thinking about that, okay, maybe we will have latkes, but only like once a year, not once a week. You know, I don't know. So, and the more important thing is we don't know how cooking will react on 3/8 gravity, and that's something that that's why I think it'll end up being done slowly, because there's only, you can use a centrifuge to mimic 3/8 gravity, but you try going around in circles and trying to cook. No. And you can do the hyperbole, the parabola vomit comet, but you're only doing that for 30 seconds at a time. And I think if you're trying to do 3/8 gravity, it's even less than 30 seconds. I think it's 20 seconds.
It's slightly more.
Or is it more?
Yeah,
Okay,
slightly
more. But you still can't finish the cooking. So a
It's
lot
like-
of this
it's
is
like
going to be learning.
It's like a quick fire challenge, trying to
Yeah.
trying to cook at the
Yeah.
point in the arc when you
45 seconds.
Yeah.
Saute
Yeah.
this, then stop.
Yeah.
Saute
As
that,
a-
then stop.
as a chef. This is one of the area that I find absolutely most interesting, because, you know, for anyone who cooks knows that the specific physical manipulation of the food in the bowl, in the pan, in the mixer, in the blender, like all these very important sort of physical factors ultimately determine a lot about the enjoyability of the food. How hard you press the thing down as you caramelize it. Like, are there Maillard reactions in the food that we cook on, you know, on eventually, like on a trip to Mars, or
Should be, because
or
that's
on a-
just protein and sugar.
Sure, but heat, you know,
Yeah, you do
caramelization,
need heat,
you know,
yeah.
caramelization of the potatoes that we grow, you know, toasting of the bread
The
that we grow
bread,
from the
yeah,
wheat.
yeah.
All of those things are really important. But then also, like, the contact between, you know, the piece of meat and the pan, for example, the specific contact, the you know, the weight and density and composition of the material. All of these things are going to influence, like, again, as a cook, these are the nuances that we sometimes instinctively and sometimes intellectually employ in the preparation of the food. And the ultimate quality is really determined on the sort of spectrum of understanding that you have, again, maybe instinctively or maybe not, of the physics and the rheology and the chemistry and the behavior of the water inside your food. And that's where great cooking comes from. So that's really interesting to see how the tools and the equipment and the processes, you know, like, how do you make a meringue at 3HG?
Well, and like one thing about that too is, like, what I talked about is astronaut or farmer, and now we're going to ask them to be professional chefs also. So I mean,
I'll do it for.
Hey, me too. I mean, I wasn't complaining
Not
when I
me.
did it for 2 weeks, but it was eye-opening. One of the things that was really funny is we got told to bring like an applesauce cake mix, and I was like, I thought, okay, that sounds kind of good. Maybe there's a way to, you know, I get there, there's no oven. I'm like, why did they tell me to do this? So I'm looking around, what do I have in the kitchen? I had a crock pot, and I figured out how to, you know, basically slow cook an apple, you know, an apple cake, and it was really good. And I also made a giant cookie in a pan to have an unbirthday party for the crew. And so I think that these things are going to also be somewhat unique to the crew learning these things on the fly, because we're not going to figure it all before we go. But you know, it also has to be, they have to want to do that. So again, providing them those tools and environment. In Sirona, we had a list of equipment, some of it based on Michele's work, and then some extension like using sous vide potentially, you know, so that can you have it like cook overnight to a certain temperature, and then all you have to do is do that final finishing process in the, you know, at dinner or lunch. So I think that there's going to be a lot of time-saving things, you know, using a multi-cooker. Also the mass of sending all the kitchen equipment, right?
So you're definitely playing into the role of sciencing the shit out of it. There's no question about it.
Right.
To go back to that, because there really are 3 questions on this, which is...
I was going to say, yeah, we didn't actually get to the regenerative question
No,
that
we
you
didn't.
originally asked.
So let me broaden it a little
Yeah.
bit, which is from the standpoint of, you know, clearly there's new technologies that are being developed to produce food under extreme conditions. We are in a severe climate crisis, and food production has never become more important, and sustainable food production in particular. You know, with the climate crisis, whether it's water, whether it's temperature, whether it's melting poles and loss of land, you know, there's all sorts of challenges that we're all I'm not going to say going to be facing. We're facing them now. And so, what sorts of technologies, whether it's bioregenerative food production or whether it's something else, do you think hold the most promise now and in the future to deal with the extreme climatic changes that we're having here on Earth?
I think I'll take that. Is that okay if I take that one? So a lot of my work, I'm really interested in implementing it for sustainable food production on Earth, and especially in urban environments like this, because it just makes sense. And we know about a lot of spin-off technology from NASA, you know, coming back to Earth and changing the way we live life here.
Like Tang.
Like Tang. And
NASA did not develop Tang.
Oh, false advertising? Wait a minute.
It's a myth.
but they did have the orange drink. I had
No,
visual
but
evidence.
General Foods had it,
That's true.
and NASA said, ooh, good idea,
use
we'll
that.
use it.
Oh, that's fun.
And I just want to say, even though maybe everybody doesn't love Tang, I loved Tang as a kid because I'm like, yeah, the astronauts drink this. I'm going to drink it like an
And they still
astronaut.
do.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, even if it's terrible, sometimes we just love that idea.
So back to technologies.
Yeah, so back to technology. Sorry. She mentioned Tang, and I had to give the Tang spiel because that's why you guys had Tang out there, was because I was like, we should have Tang. Okay, so technologies, regenerable technologies. AgQ and the brain and Roger. So one of the things with that is pulling in, is you know, using machine learning, using AI, using all these things to aid the astronaut. But if you're using all this kind of spectral imaging and large data collection for spaceflight, all of that is relevant for here on Earth. And controlled environment agriculture, which is growing in greenhouses or being able to manipulate the environment, not growing in the field, are the ways that we're going to be able to, you know, deal with some of these climate issues. So if one of the most affected groups of people don't typically think of this as a developing community, is the million people that live above the Arctic Circle. And they're some of the most affected by climate change the fastest. They're losing their native food sources. Food is really expensive to get up there, and I literally have pictures of a $20 head of cabbage. And if it does get up there, by the time it gets there, it's not fresh. So it's a lot of the same challenges. So being able to have a system like AgQ that can help people learn how to grow their own food, it helps train them. So I say learn as you grow. That's some of the work I do with Stellar Synergetics and Autoponics. Putting domes on top of buildings and growing food, creating green spaces to grow food.
I think it scales up. That's
Yeah,
always the
I
big
do
question.
think it scales up because so if you just talk about hydroponics, it's a 90% water efficiency over field-grown crops. So from a water perspective, totally makes sense. The big problem in space is what I talked about, the lighting, the energy required. That's not such a problem here on Earth if you have, you know, in greenhouses. So it's definitely, there's lots of research that shows the data that greenhouse growing. Now, you're not going to go grow wheat in a greenhouse, okay? So it's not going to work for everything, but it is a portion of the solutions for climate change. And I think that more importantly, that if people start using these technologies and trying to implement it themselves, you know, if I can excite you to go and try to grow something because you saw this, then I think that's also super important. So people talk about the Martian, and people always ask me about it, but they got excited, and now maybe they want to grow some food, and I think that's going to help a lot too.
Is there any technology in particular you think is
So
promising?
and it's not a growth or bioregenerative, but I really think 3D printing is going to be the future. A lot of work still has to be done, but when we start talking about wanting a lot of variety in your food, wouldn't it be nice if we could sort of bring up a starch paste, or just starch, and you would add water, and a protein paste, and some lipids or fat, and then flavor it. And so you can have your own, you know, whether it's a pasta sauce with pasta or something that you don't have to have, you'll have a lot more variety. And I think that for some foods, there's enough potential that it will look very familiar to people. One company got in trouble with NASA, with the Congress, not NASA, because they were 3D printing for our team, and they advertised they 3D printed a pizza. Crust, tomato sauce, cheese, and some toppings. And Congress got angry and said, what? We're spending $100,000 on a pizza? So, but I think there's a lot of
Didn't
potential.
Beyond Meat just go for $2 billion?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, but the government didn't have to pay for it.
That's right.
So anyway, I think there's a lot of potential for the variety piece of it, for maybe some more stability, some more nutrition. It's not the growing part of it, but I think that the 3D printing will potentially replace some of the packaged food.
Okay, so quick question to end on a lighter note. So do you have a favorite science fiction representation of Mars colonization or food in space? Go.
The Martian. I think it's great. If you haven't read the book, and you read the book, if you enjoy learning about problem solving and critical thinking, because Martin Ware did a phenomenal job. He had a blog, and then people commented, so it became a book, and it's pretty true to, there's a few wrong pieces to it, but it's a great, I think it was very true to fact.
So I think everybody knows The Martian now, and that's what they think of when I give talks, which I do love. And my favorite part of that is at where he first sees the first plant and realizes he's not alone anymore in that connection to nature. That people can relate to that when I talk about why it's important. But I want to encourage people to go look for a movie that's very old, and the reason is because it's trees in space, and it's called Silent Running. It's not the best movie, I'm not going to lie, in the whole world, but the reason I love it is because it brings some of these concepts back into, I won't ruin the end, but why the people who are caring for these plants in space, how important it is, and and trees in space. What else can I say?
And Carlos, to finish this up?
Yeah, I mean, possibly one of the most famous. Obviously, the Replicator, because I'm a Trek nerd. But also the reason because it really characterizes well, I think, the cultural aspect, the individual importance of real food, because even with its incredible ability to generate any edible thing in the known galaxy, their characters still often express the imperfection of that recipe. It's not the same. It's the same in every way molecularly, but somehow it's not the same. Apples from Earth still have value to people as well. So, and just to reference back the project that you were referring to with like 3D printing specific, built-up foods, and with no disrespect at all to NASA or the people who work on a project like that. My industry, we have experience, a lot of experience, sort of trying to create abstract food, and and globally we have, our whole restaurant community, our food community has a lot of experience with this, and we find that again, it's just not the same.
No, it's not, but it may be better than the alternative.
Well, I'm pretty sure my brother Jonathan's least favorite space movie would have been 2001: A Space Odyssey. One, because I think we got stuck seeing it every other month for about 5 years, because that's where our parents dropped us off. And I'm pretty sure that's where his hatred of scrambled eggs came from. So. All right, well, let's give a round of applause to our speakers.